Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins again. It is the week 4 video lecture summary that I'm doing here for full semester students, or the second half of week 2 for my summer session students taking AM Studies 140. This is the lecture that covers, or lecture summary that covers, rather, the period between 1939 and 1974 in DC history. So, basically the period between DC becoming the international superpower nation's capital that we understand it to still be in 2020, this despite everything that's gone on over the last, say, 50 years in U.S. history in general. So what does that really mean? Well, DC is already a southern city, as we've seen. It's a segregated city as well between black and white because of white supremacy or racism, systemic racism, if you will. It's already a city that has the official dumb version of the Capitol, where you've got the Capitol, the White House, an expanding government. You've got monuments and more monuments going up, and that expands, of course, because of World War II and the U.S. not only already being a superpower, but becoming one of two superpowers by the end of the war. You also have a city that is a growing city. More and more people are moving to it. There's white migration into the city into the 1950s. There's black migration in the city through the 1960s and early 1970s. And then eventually you get immigration, particularly from Central America and South America in the period after 1960s and after 1968, and other groups as well. But we'll talk more about that in a later video lecture. For now, the main focus for this week is really how DC eventually becomes desegregated, eventually gains home rule, and it's basically because one of the other cultures in DC is a culture of protest. It's a protest culture. It's a protest culture where DC is seen as a central place in order to hold a protest of regional or even national importance, maybe even international importance, but also a city where, because of the tensions and inequalities within it, is also a site where people within the city protest about conditions that exist within DC. And so, lecture notes go over some of these. I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. The story of Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson and singing in front of the Lincoln's Memorial on somewhere around March of 1939. I can't remember the exact date. It's in your lecture notes. In any case, she's an operatic singer who has sung at Carnegie Hall, or Carnegie Hall, depending on your pronunciation, at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York and other places. And so she's one of the most famous operatic female singers in the world. So the Daughters of the American Revolution, who claim whose membership generally claims that they're descendants of founding fathers and other revolutionaries from the American Revolution period, invited her to sing at Constitution Hall. But they're also segregationists and white supremacists as well. And so when they discovered, lo and behold, that Marian Anderson was in fact a black woman, or an African American woman, if you will, and not, or as they would have said back then, a colored or a Negro in 1939, they disinvited her. Eleanor Roosevelt, who happens to be the first lady at the time of FDR, is outraged by this and says, no, we can't have this. So she talks to the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, and arranges for Marian Anderson to sing God Bless America, America the Beautiful, I can't remember which song, in front of Lincoln Memorial in March of 1939. Again, this is all in your lecture notes. I'm just expounding on it. 10,000 people show up to hear her sing in wintry weather in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial. And it's really the first time that the city is being used as a site of formal protest on a national issue. Bonus Army is one thing, I talked about in the last video lecture. It is a form of protest. This DC is being used as a site of protest by that group too. But it's not on a national issue, really. It's on an issue that affects every corner of the country, right? It's on folks who happen to have bonuses who served in World War One, not African Americans who live across the country who are being discriminated against on the basis of race, right? That's a big issue. So that's big. And so DC, for because of the Lincoln Memorial, because of its official status, starts to evolve as a city where folks can address or have their grievances redressed by coming to the Capitol to protest. Another example would be in 1941. There was something called the March on Washington movement, which is actually the precursor by 22 years to the March on Washington, led by, among others, Martin Luther King, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., in 1963. But in 1941, government is gearing the country up for potentially for war. Has contracts with defense with industries across the country to make defense implements, material, bombs, cannon shells, cannon, tanks, jeeps, airplanes, etc., etc. And they're giving out billions of dollars of contracts to folks like Ford Motor Company and General Motors and Boeing and Lockheed, what would eventually become Lockheed Martin, and Howard Hughes and a whole host of other folks, right? But most of them are not even thinking about hiring blacks to be janitors, right? Much less anything else. And even when they do, the housing they provide tends to exclude African Americans, exclude blacks from being housed there. So you've got a job, but you're basically homeless. As the case may be in places like Detroit and Chicago and Seattle and other places across the country that are starting to hire people for these defense contracts. So Philip Randolph says, this isn't going to work. So bottom line is he threatens to have lead a march on Washington with 10,000 black men marching on Washington, right? Non-violent march. The only problem is it's a segregated town, a town that in the 1920s had two KKK rallies going on there. So that might lead to white mob violence toward these African American marchers. FDR initially refused to do anything about it. Eleanor Roosevelt intervened once again, and at the end of June, about a week and a half before this march was supposed to take place, FDR issues what's known as Executive Order 8802, which basically authorizes defense industries and defense housing to not exclude people on the basis of race or color of skin, meaning that they had to be hired. Sets up a commission known as FAPC to basically watch over this. This commission doesn't really do a very good job. There's still points of exclusion and discrimination for African Americans. It's just lessened as a result of Executive Order 8802, but it's a big, big step in the right direction. So DC becomes the site for things. It's also a site for local protests against Jim Crow segregation that leads to the desegregation of DC in terms of everything from public transit in 1943 and the fire department in 1943 to stores, retail stores in 1950 and in general in terms of education in 1954. That in turn leads to white flight outside of the city in the 1950s. As more and more African Americans move to the city, more and more whites move out of the city for the surrounding suburbs of Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Fairfax County, Arlington County, and the city of Alexandria. That happens in the 1950s and 1960s. While that's going on, as the city desegregates, black middle class starts moving to other parts of the city since they're no longer restricted by residential segregation to Shaw and U Street and Detroit Park and Logan Circle and Anacostia and parts of Georgetown, but they can live anywhere in the city, right? If they have the money to afford it, and many did. That leads to the decline of U Street in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. There's also a lot of tension in the city because of all these demographic changes that I described. And so that also leads to, among other things, a lot of protesting among African Americans, a lot of bellyaching among whites, and so on and so forth. It also means that the mostly white metropolitan police department is also discriminating more and more against African Americans. So there's all that tension, and then it kind of explodes in 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee. There are over 100 riots in African American neighborhoods in cities across the country. From in addition, this is also the decade of riots in the Civil Rights Movement. There's the Watts riots in 1965. There's riots in Detroit and Cleveland in 1967, and so on. But it's not just riots. If you would be overly simplistic and quite frankly racist to just simply see them as black people just burning down their own homes, which is completely ridiculous. They weren't burning down homes for the most part. They were burning down stores. Some of them might have been black-owned businesses. A lot of them weren't, right? So this notion that blacks want to burn down their own communities is mostly a falsehood. It's mostly untrue, and it's quite frankly kind of specious to make the argument that they feel like they can burn down their communities when it's not really their community. They're protesting. Even a violent riot can also be seen as an uprising and a form of protest against everything from basically not having anything that is yours. Your neighborhood's not your own. When police can just come in and rough you up for walking down the street or driving home or coming home from work or going to work, right? Walking while black, driving while black, existing while black, breathing while black. So in that sense, we're not just talking about riots. We're talking about riots that have the intent of being uprisings and just sort of like explosions against the general wave of discrimination that these people are facing at the local, and also the fact that there's a sense of hopelessness about being able to change things for themselves and for their kids in the immediate and in the long term with the death of Martin Luther King in 1968. I say all that to say this. Yes, that's all I've said is true, but also points to the fact that a large segment of the black business community is basically burned out as a result of 5 days of unrest. That's just the bottom line in April 1968. And U Street in particular pays a heavy price for this. Area around U Street, Chinatown, parts of Mount Pleasant, parts of Columbia Heights, a huge swath of the business community there does not fully recover until the 1990s. And on the edge of gentrification, the early 1990s is when you start seeing a turnaround business-wise in these communities. It also leaves these communities poor with less of a tax base and so on. But there is one thing that comes out of the local civil rights movement here, the uprising of 68, the demographic changes to D.C. as D.C. becomes more black. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as President of the United States at the time all this stuff is happening in the 1960s, realizes it's kind of racist to have the nation's capital not have any representation at all. And so they put in steps for home rule in the late 1960s to eventually lead to the creation of an elected school board, an elected city council, and eventually an elected mayor. And this happens in a period roughly between 1967 and 1974. Lecture notes go over this in far more detail. And that leads toward the advent of someone like a Marion Barry, but not quite, because Walter Washington is actually the first mayor of D.C., first appointed by LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1967 or 68, and then elected as D.C.'s first mayor in 1974, and he served from 1975 through January 1975 through January of 1979. And so that pretty much closes the period of major events in D.C. history prior to the modern era.